In the verses 1, 2, 3 of today's text, it says, "And in the first year of Darius the Mede, I took my stand to support and protect him. Now, then, I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and then a 4th, who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king will arise, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases." This is to say that the angel Gabriel strengthened Darius of the Medes Bactrian Empire to conquer the empires of Assyria, Grogus, and Babylon. He also strengthened the royal power so that he could rule the empire stably. In this way, Babylon, which had destroyed Judah, was destroyed, and the grudge in Judah's heart was relieved. God avenged the enemy. God had foretold through the prophet that the period of Judah's punishment would be 70 years. Now that the time had come, God kept his promise and allowed Babylon to be conquered through Darius and the Jews to return to their homeland. God sovereignly runs history, and he runs the history of the world with his people at its center. That is why the center of history is where God's people are. This is still the case today. In the verses 2 of the main text, it says, "Now then, I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will arise in Persia." Here, 3 kings refers to Cambyses, Smerdis, and Darius. Who will appear after the first king, Cyrus? King Darius was the king who approved the building of the temple to Ezra. And in verse 2, it says, "And then a 4th, who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece." The 4th of these later kings is King Ahasuerus, who appears in the book of Esther and is referred to as Xerxes. Esther 1:1 says, "This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes, who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush. King Ahasuerus was so wealthy that he held a feast for 180 days, or 6 months, to show off the glory of the kingdom and his own dignity, inviting the major officials of the empire." And in verse 3 of the main text, it says, "Then a mighty king will arise, who will rule with great power and do as he pleases." A mighty king in the future refers to Alexander the Great of Greece. In verse 4, it says, "Fter he has arisen. His empire will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his empire will be uprooted and given to others." Alexander the Great is also said to have divided his kingdom when he was strong, and it would be divided into 4 parts. After Alexander's death, the country did not return to his descendants as Daniel's prophecy foretold, and it was divided and ruled by 4 of his generals. So the country was taken and returned to other people. The world is ever changing. Therefore, there is nothing permanent in the world, only transience. Therefore, believers should not be overly concerned about what happens in the world. You should not look at the world, but look above where God is. First, Daniel speaks through Daniel about the war that will take place after the Hellenistic Empire. Verses 5 through the last verse in this chapter are prophecies related to war. This prophecy was fulfilled in reality between 250 BC and 190 BC. In verse 5 of the text, it says, "The king of the south will become strong. But one of his commanders will become even stronger than he, and will rule his own kingdom with great power." Here, the kings of the south refers to the Ptolemaic dynasty, which was formed after the death of King Alexander, when 4 generals divided the country and each became king. But one of his commanders will become even stronger than he. Although the Ptolemaic dynasty will be strong, Alexander's general, one of the 4 kings of the Seleucid dynasty, would become stronger and more powerful. In other words, it was a prophecy of a war between the Ptolemaic dynasty, the southern dynasty, and the Seleucid dynasty, the northern dynasty, which were divided from the Hellenistic Empire. Here, the king of the south is Ptolemy, who ruled over the Egypt region, and he became strong and gained control over Palestine. However, the Seleucid dynasty, one of those monarchs, controlled Syria and Babylon. The Cassander dynasty controlled Macedonia and Greece, and the Lysimachus dynasty controlled Thrace and Asia Minor. In verse 5 of the text, it is said that one of his commanders will become even stronger than he. This refers to Seleucus Nicator, the first king of the Syrian kingdom. It is said that Ptolemy of Egypt and Seleucus of Syria are going to war. Then, in verse 6, it says, "After some years, they will become allies. The daughter of the king of the south will go to the king of the north to make an alliance. But she will not retain her power, and he and his power will not last. In those days she will be betrayed, together with her royal escort, and her father and the one who supported her." The Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt and the Seleucid dynasty of Syria attempted to form an alliance through an arranged marriage, but the result was ultimately unsuccessful. As predicted, in 250 BC, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the Ptolemaic king of Egypt, arranged his daughter Berenice to marry Deos, the Antiochus II of the Seleucid dynasty of Syria. The Seleucid dynasty of Egypt was initially the weakest of the 4, and the strongest was the Ptolemaic dynasty of Syria. So Seleucus maintained peace by marrying Theos, the son of Ptolemy, in an arranged marriage. However, when Ptolemy's son Philadelphus, the father of Berenice, died, Theos, the king of the northern kingdom, Seleucus reinstated his ex-wife Laodice to the position of queen. The restored Laodice, after seizing power, held a grudge against her husband, who had deposed her, and as soon as she was restored, she poisoned her husband, Deos, and murdered Berenice, who had come from Egypt, and her child. She went on to poison even her father-in-law Antiochus II, and eliminated all those who had pushed for an arranged marriage with the Egyptian princess Berenice, and enthroned her son as the king of the northern king Seleucus. His son was Seleucus II, Seleucus Callinicus. This tragic news soon reached Egypt. Ptolemy, the younger brother of Berenice, who was the king of Egypt, raised an army to avenge his sister and attack the northern king Seleucus. The Ptolemy dynasty of Egypt, the southern king, Euergetus, won a great victory in this war, captured and executed Laodice, the queen mother of Syria, and signed a treaty with Callinicus of the Seleucus dynasty of the north, and then withdrew to Egypt. So in verses 7 and 8, it says, one from her family line will arise to take her place. He will attack the forces of the king of the north and enter his fortress. He will fight against them and be victorious. He will also seize their gods, their metal images and their valuable articles of silver and gold, and carry them off to Egypt. For some years he will leave the king of the north alone. On the other hand, Callinicus, who lost his mother, Laodice, and was robbed of much of his wealth, sharpened his sword for revenge. So he finally set out on an expedition to Egypt. But unfortunately, he encountered a huge storm on his way to Egypt, and was forced to return home without fighting. That is why the text verse 9 says, then the king of the north will invade the realm of the king of the south but will retreat to his own country. A bloody civil war between Egypt and Syria lasted for 150 years. This means that revenge is endless. The law prescribes equal amounts of revenge, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, to prevent excessive revenge. This was not because God allowed revenge, but to prohibit excessive revenge and prevent a vicious circle of revenge. And the exile system was established to prevent revenge for mistakes made by accident. So, in principle, the law also prohibits revenge. Jesus encourages us to love our enemies. That is why the apostles command us to show tolerance to our enemies. Whenever we repent, we are forgiven by God's grace. Anyone who has experienced God's grace should be able to love and forgive others. Jesus forgave the ignorant people who spit and mocked him on the cross. Stephen the deacon also forgave those who threw stones at him and killed him. Titus 3:2 says, to slander no one, to be peaceable and considerate, and always to be gentle toward everyone. And so on. Living like this breaks the vicious circle of revenge, and leads to a peaceful world. Otherwise, the world will become a hell that the devil wants, with endless wars and massacres that continue to reproduce tragedy. I pray that you will live as a child of God, who loves the world and makes it beautiful. Second, in a world without forgiveness and love, there will only be an endless history of revenge and ruthless war. The main text verses 10 to 19 is a prophecy about the war between Seleucus III, Antiochus III, and Ptolemy, Philopator and Ptolemy Epiphanes of Egypt, the sons of Callinicus of Syria, a vassal of the northern kingdom. In verses 10 and 11, it says, his sons will prepare for war and assemble a great army, which will sweep on like an irresistible flood, and carry the battle as far as his fortress. And then the king of the south will march out in a rage and fight against the king of the north, who will raise a large army, but it will be defeated. In verse 10, his sons refers to Seleucus II's two sons, Seleucus III Soter and Antiochus III Magnus of Syria. Seleucus III was the first of these to ascend the throne in 227 BC. But he was killed by his companions in the Asia Minor War. His younger brother, Antiochus III, succeeded him on the throne. The text refers to his expedition to Phoenicia and Palestine around 219 BC after he ascended the throne. And verse 11 tells us the outcome of the expedition. In other words, the expedition of Antiochus III of Syria to Palestine was blocked by the counterattack of Ptolemy IV Philopator of Egypt, the king of the south, and eventually ended in defeat at the Battle of Raphia. Meanwhile, Ptolemy IV of Egypt, who became proud of his own greatness, entered the Holy of Holies of the Jerusalem temple, which was off limits to anyone other than the high priest, and was punished by God, dying an unexplained death. Therefore, in verse 12 of the text, it says, when the army is carried off, the king of the south will be filled with pride and will slaughter many thousands, yet he will not remain triumphant. In verse 13, Antiochus III of Syria said, for the king of the north will muster another army, larger than the first, and after several years, he will advance with a huge army fully equipped. Then, in verse 14, in those times many will rise against the king of the south. Those who are violent among your own people will rebel in fulfillment of the vision, but without success. Antiochus III of Syria, who was defeated by Ptolemachus IV of Egypt in the Battle of Raphia, subsequently invaded the Persian and Asian regions and secured a vast territory that extended from the Caspian Sea in the north to the Indus River in the east. In this way, they doubled their national power and used Egypt's internal unrest as an opportunity to attack the Ptolemy dynasty again. At the time, the Ptolemy dynasty was in turmoil due to the death of Ptolemy IV and the ascension to the throne of Ptolemy V, who was 4 years old, in 203 BC. This led to rebellions by vassals, and Antiochus of Syria invaded Egypt. And the Jewish people, who were a vassal state of Egypt, would take this opportunity to attempt independence. However, such things were done to fulfill their own vanity and private purposes, regardless of God's will. That is why it says, they will stumble. In verse 15, then the king of the north will come and build up siege ramps and will capture a fortified city. The forces of the south will be powerless to resist, even their best troops will not have the strength to stand. At this time, the Jewish people tried to help Antiochus to gain independence, but this soon led to retaliation from the generals of the Ptolemy kingdom. In verse 16, it says, the invader will do as he pleases, no one will be able to stand against him. He will establish himself in the beautiful land and will have the power to destroy it. The northern king Antiochus III of Syria formed an alliance with Philip of Macedonia and attacked the Ptolemy dynasty of Egypt, saying that he would stand on the glorious land. This refers to the fact that he occupied Palestine. So, the army of Antiochus III of Syria defeated the army under Scopas of Egypt at the Battle of Panium in 200 BC. So, the Egyptian army retreated to the fortified city of Sidon, a Phoenician seaport. However, Sidon was also captured in 198 BC, and Palestine fell into the hands of Antiochus III of Syria. Then, Antiochus III, who conquered Palestine, changed his policy of invading Egypt and foretold that he would make a political peace treaty with Egypt. Therefore, in verse 17, it says, he will determine to come with the might of his entire kingdom and will make an alliance with the king of the south. And he will give him a daughter in marriage in order to overthrow the kingdom, but his plans will not succeed or help him. So, Antiochus III of Syria tried to strengthen his influence over the Ptolemy dynasty by giving his daughter Cleopatra as the queen of Ptolemy V of Egypt and thus ruin the country. However, Cleopatra, on the contrary, conspired with her husband Ptolemy V to make him form an alliance with Rome, which dealt a fatal blow to Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great. Cleopatra here is a homonym for Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt who was related to Julius Caesar and Antony of Rome. Proverbs chapter 16:1 says, to humans belong the plans of the heart, but from the Lord comes the proper answer of the tongue. Things do not always go as people want. After all these plans to get Egypt in his grasp had failed, Antiochus III said in verse 18, then he will turn his attention to the coastlands and will take many of them, but a commander will put an end to his insolence and will turn his insolence back on him. Antiochus III drove out the Egyptian army, took control of Palestine, and subjugated Armenia, Parthia, and Bactria. However, but a commander will put an end to his insolence and will turn his insolence back on him. When Antiochus III's invasion of Egypt failed, he turned his attention to other countries along the western Mediterranean coast. At first, he was able to conquer many areas along the Mediterranean coast. However, his victories did not last long. Rome did not tolerate Antiochus III's advance into Europe and sent Scipio Asiaticus to defeat Antiochus III at Magnesia, a place in Turkey, and 20 hostages were sent to Rome and had to pay a huge war reparations. Then Antiochus III was killed. Therefore, in verse 19, it says, after this, he will turn back toward the fortresses of his own country but will stumble and fall, to be seen no more. Third, history shows that those who oppose God will eventually be destroyed. Antiochus Epiphanes of Syria, the model of the Antichrist, appears from 175 to 164 B.C. Antiochus IV and Philopator succeeded Antiochus III in Syria, but he sent his minister Heliodorus to tour the country to collect war reparations due to his father's defeat, even to the extent of robbing the treasures of the Temple of Jerusalem. Therefore, in verse 20, it says, his successor will send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor. In a few years, however, he was assassinated by his direct subordinate, Heliodorus. Therefore, in verse 20, it says, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. After that, his younger brother Antiochus Epiphanes ascended to the throne from 175 to 164 BC. Records of him are found from verse 21 to the last 45 verses. This is because Antiochus Epiphanes is implied as a type of the Antichrist who will appear at the end of time. Antiochus Epiphanes, the second son of Antiochus III, was taken hostage when his father surrendered to Rome in 190 BC, and spent 14 years in Rome. After hearing the news of his brother's murder, he rushed back to overthrow Heliodorus and take the throne. After that, he used many devious tricks and cunning schemes to consolidate his position and power on the throne in place of his nephew. So in verse 21, it says, he will be succeeded by a contemptible person who has not been given the honor of royalty. He will invade the kingdom when its people feel secure, and he will seize it through intrigue. Later, the army of Heliodorus, allied with the high priest Onias III, attacks Euphrates, but fails. So in verse 22, it says, then an overwhelming army will be swept away before him, both it and a prince of the covenant will be destroyed. Antiochus Epiphanes signed a peace treaty with his nephew, Egyptian king Ptolemy VI Philometor, but then broke the treaty and secretly occupied small cities one by one. Not only that, he believes in the peace treaty and suddenly invades the most fertile part of Egypt, which is defenseless, and seizes a lot of plunder. He also distributes the plunder to his people as a way to win their favor. In verse 24, it says, "He will distribute plunder, loot and wealth among his followers. He will plot the overthrow of fortresses but only for a time." And then, Epiphanes led his army on the second expedition and invaded Egypt. So, in verse 25, it says, "With a large army he will stir up his strength and courage against the king of the south." In response, the king of Egypt, Ptolemy V, will lead a large army to fight back, but in the second half of verse 25, it says, "The king of the south will wage war with a large and very powerful army, but he will not be able to stand because of the plots devised against him." The Egyptians are defeated by Syria because the Egyptians' wise men are bribed by Epiphanes and betray Egypt. Therefore, in verse 26, it says, "Those who eat his food will destroy him, and his army will be scattered, and many will fall and die." In the end, Ptolemy V of Egypt is defeated and taken prisoner. Ptolemy V, while in confinement, signed a peace treaty with Syria and accepted Epiphanes' proposal to divide Egypt, effectively dividing Alexandria between Ptolemy VII, the Pisces kingdom, and Memphis, the Philomathus kingdom. However, they were secretly planning to unite the forces of Egypt to counter Syria, so this treaty of peace soon became useless. This is what is said in verse 27, "The two kings, with their hearts bent on evil, will sit at the same table and lie to each other. But to no avail, because an end will still come at the appointed time." On his way back from the expedition to Egypt, Antiochus Epiphanes of Syria broke the peace treaty with Israel, attacked the Jews, reinstated Menelaus, whom he had appointed instead of Jeshobeam, as the high priest, plundered temple vessels, and stationed foreign troops in the city of Jerusalem. This is stated in verse 28, "The king of the north will return to his own country with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant. He will take action against it and then return to his own country." And after that, he launched the third expedition to Egypt, capturing Kubra and marching all the way to Alexandria, but in verse 29, "At the appointed time, he will invade the south again, but this time the outcome will be different from what it was before." In other words, he will be forced to retreat due to the interference of Rome, which had formed an alliance with Egypt. Epiphanes, who failed to launch the third expedition to Egypt, could not contain his anger and began to persecute the Jews in earnest. At this time, they gave power and strength to the Judean apostates who had abandoned God's law and actively sympathized with Epiphanes' Hellenization policy, and put them at the forefront of Judea's Hellenization policy. In verse 30, it says, "Ships of the western coastlands will oppose him, and he will lose heart. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant. He will return and show favor to those who forsake the Holy Covenant." At this time, in verse 31, the temple is used to worship the statue of Zeus, which is an abomination that brings ruin, stopping the daily sacrifices, and to offer the blood of pigs, which are unclean animals. Then, a resistance movement is started, led by the Maccabees. Verse 32 says, "Those who have violated the covenant, but the people who know their God will firmly resist him." However, this resistance movement did not achieve much and many people were martyred. Therefore, verse 33 says, "Those who are wise will instruct many, though for a time they will fall by the sword or be burned or captured or plundered." However, when the Jewish resistance movement was about to disappear, the revolution led by the Judah Maccabees succeeded, giving people the strength to join the Maccabean revolution. However, many of the participants in the revolution joined out of fear rather than pure motivation, fearing the Maccabean army's ruthless punishment of the Hellenists. So, the initial religious purity and homogeneity disappeared, and a tendency to trust human power more than God emerged. Therefore, in verse 34, "And many who are not sincere will join them." At this time, God was testing the faith of the people who had faith in Jehovah and was also a process of refinement, separating the wheat from the tares among those who participated in the Maccabean uprising and purifying them through faith. In verse 35, it says, "Some of the wise will stumble, so that they may be refined, purified and made spotless until the time of the end, for it will still come at the appointed time." Verses 36 through 39 record the culmination of Antiochus Eupator's arrogance and his process of deifying himself. Epiphanes deified himself and had his portrait engraved on the coins he minted at the time, and the letters Theos, meaning God of the gods, were engraved on them. In verse 36, it says, "The king will do as he pleases. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed, for what has been determined must take place." And verses 40 through 45 describe the final great battle between Antiochus Epiphanes of Syria and Ptolemy V of Egypt. Verse 40 says, "At the time of the end the king of the south will engage him in battle. And the king of the north will storm out against him with chariots and cavalry and a great fleet of ships. He will invade many countries and sweep through them like a flood." When Epiphanes attacked Egypt, Israel was not spared from the flames of war. At this time, Edom, Moab, and Ammon complied with Epiphanes' Hellenization policy and joined the army that was attacking the Jews. Epiphanes continued to advance, capturing Egypt and taking control of Libya to the west and Greece to the south. In verse 43, it says, "He will gain control of the treasures of gold and silver and all the riches of Egypt, with the Libyans and Cushites in submission." But that was only for a short time. And Epiphanes heard news of a rebellion in the northeastern region of Syria and withdrew his troops to suppress the rebels. In verse 44, it says, "But reports from the east and the north will alarm him, and he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many." However, while going to fight the rebels, he tries to attack Judah again and dies as a result of God's punishment. He meets his end between the Mediterranean and Jerusalem. 45 He will pitch his royal tents between the seas atf the beautiful holy mountain. Yet he will come to his end, and no one will help him. Therefore, there is no need to envy the prosperity of the wicked. I pray that you will live by faith no matter what trials you face.